Hey buddy, if you love dark horror stories, hit subscribe now because tonight you won't be alone.
The heat in Pike County didn't just sit on you, it owned you. It was a physical weight, a wet wool blanket smelling of diesel fumes and rotten kudzu that wrapped around my throat the moment I killed the engine. I sat in the rental Jeep for a long minute, watching the dashboard GPS flicker and die. It had been struggling for the last 10 miles, the digital map spinning in confused circles before finally giving up the ghost entirely. I wasn't surprised. The topographic maps in the university archives had described Blackwood Hollow as a geomagnetic anomaly, a fancy academic way of saying that compasses didn't work here and cell service was a fantasy. I stepped out onto the gravel, my boots crunching loud enough to make a stray dog bark 3 houses down. This was the end of the line, a cluster of rusted tin roofs and timber frames clinging to the side of a valley so steep it felt like the earth was trying to shrug the town off its shoulders. I was here for the dissertation. That was the capitalized justification for driving 12 hours from D.C. into the spine of Appalachia. My thesis was on the intersection of acoustic geology and regional folklore. In plain English, I wanted to prove that certain haunted locations were just geological echo chambers, trapping infrasound that made the human brain hallucinate ghosts. I was arrogant, I was educated, and I was about to be proven wrong in the worst way possible. The cabin I'd rented was a structure called the Rookery, a sagging A-frame at the edge of the tree line. The owner, a man named Elias Thorne, was waiting for me on the porch. He looked like he'd been carved out of the same gray shale that lined the creek beds, hard, weathered, and impossible to read. "You the one with the machines?" Thorne asked, not bothering to stand up from his rocking chair. He was whittling a piece of driftweed, the knife moving with terrifying precision. "Silas Vane," I said, extending a hand. He didn't take it. He just looked at my wrist, then at the trunk of the Jeep where my Pelican cases were stacked. "Vane," he repeated, tasting the name like it was spoiled milk. "Don't know any Vanes in these parts. You got kin in the coal fields?" "No, sir. Family's from Baltimore," I lied. It was a half lie. My father was from Baltimore. His father, well, the genealogy was a murky mess of closed adoptions and lost records, a puzzle I'd never bothered to solve. "I'm here to record the ambient noise in the valley for the university." Thorne spat a dark tobacco juice over the railing. It hit a patch of dead grass with a wet slap. "Ambient noise, is that what they call it now?" He stood up, his joints cracking like dry twigs. He pointed a crooked finger toward the dense wall of forest behind the cabin. The trees there were old growth, massive oaks and sycamores that blotted out the late afternoon sun. "Down that path is the water," Thorne said, his voice dropping an octave. "We don't name it. Maps call it a tributary of the Tug Fork. We call it the Invite." "The Invite?" I asked, pulling my field notebook from my back pocket. "Why?"
"Because it asks you in," Thorne said. He leaned over the railing, his eyes milky with cataracts, but sharp with intent. Listen to me, boy. You stay on the bank. You don't cross the water after the sun drops. And if you hear your name, you don't answer. You don't look. You pack your gear and you run back to this porch. Is that a local superstition? I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Thorn laughed, a dry, rattling sound. Superstition is what you call it when you're safe in a city. Out here, it's just the rules of the road. That water has a long memory. It remembers things that happened before you were born. It remembers voices. He tossed the keys to the cabin at me. I fumbled to catch them. One more thing, he said, turning back to his door. Do not drink it. Do not wash in it. And for God's sake, don't look at your reflection in it when the moon is down. You might not like who looks back. By 8 p.m., I had the gear set up. The rookery was damp, smelling of mold and old cedar, but it had power. I set up my base station on the kitchen table, a laptop, a backup hard drive, and a stack of fresh magnetic tapes. I wasn't just using digital, I was using analog. Analog captured the imperfections, the hiss and pop that digital smoothing algorithms erased. If there was a ghost in the machine, it would live on the tape. I hauled the heavy equipment down the trail Thorn had indicated. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees as soon as I entered the canopy. The silence was immediate and oppressive. Usually, a forest in summer is a cacophony of life, cicadas, tree frogs, birds. Here, it was dead quiet. Not peaceful quiet, predatory quiet. I found the creek. It was underwhelming at first glance, a ribbon of black water, maybe 6 feet across, moving sluggishly over smooth gray stones. The banks were steep mud, slick and treacherous. But as I stood there, adjusting the tripod for the parabolic microphone, I felt it. A vibration. It wasn't a sound, it was deeper than that. It was a hum that started in the soles of my boots and worked its way up my shin bones. It felt like standing next to a massive transformer, but there wasn't an electrical line for 20 miles. Log entry 1, I whispered into my lapel mic, checking the gain levels. August 14th, 2015 hours. Subject, unnamed creek, locally referred to as the Invite. Atmospheric pressure is dropping. Humidity is nearly 100%. Subjective feeling of unease. I pointed the shotgun mic at the center of the stream. I put on my studio-grade headphones, the large, noise-canceling cups sealing out the physical world. I turned the dial. Instantly, the world became a roar. The creek wasn't silent. Through the microphone, the water sounded like it was screaming. It was a rushing, churning cacophony of fluid dynamics that sounded almost biologic. It sounded like blood rushing through a massive artery. I frowned, tweaking the frequency knobs. I filtered out the low end, trying to isolate the mid-range. That's when I heard the first anomaly. Click, click, click. It sounded like stones being knocked together underwater. Rhythmic, deliberate. I scanned the water with my flashlight. The beam cut through the humid air like a lightsaber. The water was undisturbed. No ripples, no fish breaking the surface. Click, click, click. I panned the microphone slowly to the left, following the sound upstream. The audio signal grew stronger. Whatever was making that noise was moving, and it was moving toward me. I took the headphones off, needing to verify it with my own ears. Silence. The forest was tomb quiet. The water lapped gently at the mud. I put the headphones back on. Click, click. Loud, right in front of the mic. I jumped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stared at the empty water. My brain tried to rationalize it. Crustaceans, snapping turtles, gas bubbles releasing from the sediment. But the rhythm was too perfect. It was a cadence. I checked the levels on the Tascam recorder. The needle was bouncing into the red, registering a high decibel input that I couldn't hear. The discrepancy between my eyes, my ears, and the machine induced a sudden wave of vertigo. I decided to run a test. I reached into my bag and pulled out a heavy stone I'd brought from the cabin driveway. I tossed it into the center of the creek. Splash. The visual splash was normal. The ripples spread outward. But in the headphones, nothing. The audio feed didn't register the splash. The clicking continued uninterrupted, as if the physical stone hadn't touched the sonic reality of the creek. "Jesus," I whispered. Then the clicking stopped. The hiss of the tape filled the headphones. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Then a sound cut through the static. It was faint, buried deep in the noise floor, but it was unmistakable. It wasn't a click. It was a voice. It was a woman's voice, breathless, panicked, cold. I froze. I looked around the clearing. "Hello?" I called out, taking the headphones off. "Is someone there?" The woods swallowed my voice. No answer. I put the cans back on. So cold. Silas.
My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a random word. It was my name. And the voice, it sounded like my mother. My mother who had died in a car accident when I was 6. I barely remembered her voice, only from old VHS home movies. But the timbre, the specific lilting pitch, it was her. I reached for the recorder, my hand trembling. I needed to mark this timestamp. I needed to capture this. But as I reached out, the water in the creek did something impossible. It rose. It didn't flood from upstream. It simply swelled, the level rising vertically by 3 inches in the span of a second, defying gravity. The black water crested the bank and licked at the toe of my boot. It was hungry. I scrambled back, grabbing the tripod and hauling it away from the edge. The moment I moved back, the water receded instantly, dropping back to its original level. It was reactive. I stood there in the dark, breathing hard, the headphones still around my neck chattering with static. I looked at the Tascam. The tape was still rolling. I had come here to debunk a myth. I had come here to prove that geology creates ghosts. But geology doesn't know my name. Rocks don't speak with my dead mother's voice. I packed the gear. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the mic. I needed to get back to the cabin.
I needed to analyze the waveform. I needed a drink. As I turned to leave, shining my light one last time across the black mirror of the water, I saw something snagged on a submerged branch near the far bank. It was a shoe, a child's sneaker. It looked fresh, bright red with white laces. I hesitated. The academic in me wanted to document it. The survival instinct in me screamed, "Run!" I ran. I scrambled up the trail, the heavy gear banging against my spine. I didn't stop until I hit the porch of the rookery. I burst inside, locking the deadbolt behind me, chest heaving. I dumped the gear on the kitchen table. The cabin felt safer, the yellow light of the incandescent bulbs pushing back the dark. I poured a glass of tap water and downed it, then sat in front of the recorder. Okay, let's see what you really are. I rewound the tape. I put the headphones on. I pressed play. I heard my own footsteps crunching on the shale. I heard my voice, log entry 1. Then came the silence where the clicking should have been. But on the tape, there was no clicking. Instead, underneath the sound of the rushing water, there was singing. A low, multi-voiced chorus humming a melody that sounded vaguely like a lullaby. It was beautiful and terrifying. And as the recording reached the moment where I had heard my mother's voice, the choir stopped abruptly. A single voice spoke. It wasn't my mother. It wasn't the breathless woman I had heard in the field. It was a man's voice, calm, deep, and terrifyingly close to the microphone. "He is listening," the voice said. And then, from the background of the recording, from a distance that sounded like it was right behind where I had been standing, came a second voice. "Let him listen. He needs to learn the words." I ripped the headphones off and threw them onto the table. I stared at the dark window of the cabin. The glass reflected the room behind me. But out there, beyond the reflection, the woods were waiting. And for the first time, I realized that the silence outside wasn't empty. It was holding its breath.
I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen of the rookery, watching the sun drag itself over the ridge like a bruised swimmer hauling himself onto a bank. The coffee in my mug had gone cold 3 hours ago, a stagnant black pool that reminded me too much of the creek. On the table, the Tascam recorder sat in a nest of tangled cables. I had listened to that 10-second clip 100 times. He is listening. Let him listen. I had run it through my laptop's spectral analysis software. The waveform didn't make sense. Human speech usually registers between 85 Hz and 255 Hz. The voices on the tape were hitting frequencies as low as 15 Hz, infrasound. It shouldn't have been audible. It should have been a vibration in the chest, a feeling of dread, not articulate words. The fact that the magnetic tape had translated it into intelligible English defied every law of acoustics I knew. But it was the familiarity that gnawed at me, the cadence of the male voice. It wasn't just a generic spooky voice, it had a tidewater accent, a very specific archaic dialect from the coastal mid-Atlantic, my family's dialect. At 9 a.m., I drove into town. I needed to get away from the cabin, away from the tree line that seemed to be inching closer to the porch. I needed fluorescent lights, air conditioning, and the sterile smell of paper. The Pike County Public Library was a brick bunker built in the 70s, smelling of carpet cleaner and old glue. I bypassed the fiction section and went straight to the reference desk. The librarian, a woman named Martha with reading glasses on a chain and a skepticism that ran bone deep, looked up from her computer. "You're the one renting Thorne's place," she stated. It wasn't a question. In a town this small, privacy was a myth. "I'm doing research on local hydrology," I said, sticking to my cover story. Specifically, the tributaries feeding the Tug Fork. There's a creek behind the property. Locals call it the Invite. Does that name appear in any official records? Martha's typing stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keys. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses, her expression hardening. "You will find a local history section in the back," she said, pointing to a glass-walled room. "Microfilm is in the cabinets, but you won't find the Invite on any map. It's officially designated as Creek 404 on the geological surveys. Most folks just pretend it isn't there." Why? "Because nothing good comes from talking about bad ground," she said, turning back to her screen. I spent the next 6 hours in the microfilm room. The machine whirred and clicked, scrolling through decades of the Pikeville Daily News and grainy scan copies of handwritten sheriff's logs. I started with a keyword search for drowning. The results were staggering. In 1954, 3 brothers, the Miller boys, went fishing in the creek. 2 came back. The third, a 7-year-old named Timothy, was never found. The search party reported that the creek was only ankle deep at the time. In 1968, a hunter named Jebediah Holt was found dead on the bank. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, but the coroner's notes, scribbled in the margins, were what caught my eye. Victim's throat packed with wet river clay, no signs of struggle, boots dry. In 1982, a teenage couple camped near the water. The girl, Sarah P., was found wandering the highway 3 days later, catatonic. She never spoke again. The boy was gone. I began to build a timeline. The disappearances weren't random. They happened in clusters every 20 to 30 years. It was a cycle, a feeding cycle. But it was the names that made my stomach turn over. I found a digitized copy of a census ledger from 1920. I was scrolling through the handwritten names, looking for property boundaries, when a familiar sequence of letters jumped out at me. Survey Team, August 1924, Sector 4. Lead Surveyor, Silas Vane. I froze. Silas Vane, my great-great-uncle. The family legend was that he had run off to California to pan for gold and died a drunk in San Francisco. My father had never mentioned Kentucky. He had never mentioned Appalachia. I pulled up the scanned police report attached to the census file. Missing Person Report, August 14th, 1924. Subject, Silas Vane, 32, surveyor from Baltimore. Last seen near the mouth of the Nameless Creek, crossing the shale bed. Notes: subject complained of auditory hallucinations prior to disappearance, claimed the water was reciting his genealogy. Search suspended due to sudden flash flood. I sat back in the chair, the cold air of the library raising goosebumps on my arms. August 14th. Today was August 15th. He had vanished exactly 100 years ago, almost to the day. I wasn't here by accident. My thesis, my funding, my sudden interest in acoustic geology, it felt less like academic curiosity and more like a summons. I hadn't found this place. I had been pulled here. I printed the document. The grain of the paper felt rough under my thumb. As the printer whirred, I looked at the grainy photo of the 1924 survey team. Silas Vane stood in the back, a tall man with high cheekbones and dark, deep-set eyes. He looked exactly like me. I drove back to the rookery as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, bruised shadows across the road. The hollow felt tighter today, the trees pressing in against the asphalt. When I pulled into the driveway, Elias Thorne was there again, hacking at a stubborn stump with a pickaxe. He stopped as I got out of the Jeep, leaning on the handle, his chest heaving. "You found something," he said. He wasn't asking. He saw the folder in my hand. "My uncle," I said, my voice tight. "Silas Vane. He died here in 1924. Thorne nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. "That water isn't water. It's a membrane. Think of it like a recording tape that never stops rolling. It captures everything. The deer drinking, the bird singing, the last breath of a dying man. And when the conditions are right, it hits play." He pointed a calloused finger at my chest. "You got his blood. That's why it's waking up. It tastes you."
"That's impossible," I said, clinging to my rationality like a life raft. "Water is hydrogen and oxygen. It doesn't have memory." "Go down there tonight," Thorne said softly, "but take a mirror, not a camera, a mirror." "Why?" "Just look at the reflection," he said, turning back to his cabin, "and tell me if the man in the water blinks when you do." I shouldn't have gone back. I should have packed the Jeep and driven until I hit the Atlantic Ocean, but the pull was physical now. It was a hunger in my gut, a need to know. I hiked down the trail at twilight. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone, like a thunderstorm was about to break, but the sky was clear. I reached the bank. The creek was calm, too calm. I set up the equipment differently this time. I placed 3 distinct microphones, one parabolic aimed at the center, one contact mic taped to a submerged rock, and one omnivorous mic hung from a tree branch. I wanted to capture the soundscape from every angle. I didn't bring a mirror. I was too afraid of what Thorn had said. I sat on a flat rock, 5 feet from the water's edge. I put on the headphones. Hiss. The static was louder tonight, more aggressive. "This is Silas Vane," I said into the dictaphone, my voice shaking. "August 15th, returning to the site of the anomaly." "Elias Vane." The response was instant. It didn't come from the headphones. It came from the air. I whipped my head around. "Who's there?" "Who's there?" It was coming from the water, but it wasn't an echo. An echo is fainter, distant. This was louder, sharper. I looked at the water. The surface was perfectly flat, black as oil. Then the surface tension broke, not with a splash, but with a shape. A ripple formed in the center of the stream, pushing outward. I watched the audio levels on my laptop screen. The waveforms were going crazy, spiking into the red, creating jagged patterns that looked almost like handwriting. I hit record. "Is that you, Elias?" I whispered. The water bubbled. A large singular bubble rose to the surface and popped. Pop. In the headphones, the pop was deafening, but following the pop, a voice spoke. It was clear. It was close. It was the voice of a young man, terrified and weeping. "Don't write it down. Don't let them write it down." "Don't write what down?" I asked. "The name," the voice sobbed. "If you write it, they can read it. If they read it, they can find you." "Who?"
The ones who wait in the silt. Suddenly, the water level surged. It rushed up the bank, moving with impossible speed, surrounding the rock I was sitting on. My boots were submerged. The water was freezing, so cold it burned. I scrambled to stand up, but the mud was slick, greased with something that felt like mucus. I slipped, one hand plunging into the dark water to catch myself. Something brushed my fingers. It felt like hair, wet, human hair floating in the current. I yanked my hand back, scrambling up the bank on all fours, gasping for air. I shone my flashlight into the water where my hand had been. For a second, just a fraction of a second, the beam of light illuminated something pale beneath the surface. It was a face. It was upturned, eyes wide open, mouth agape in a silent scream. It was pale, bloated, and ancient. But it wasn't Elias Vane. It was me. I stared at the face in the water. It was wearing my glasses. It had my beard. It was wearing the same plaid shirt I had on right now. But its skin was gray, and its eyes were clouded with the milky film of death. The lips of the corpse moved, and through the headphones still around my neck, I heard my own dead voice speak. "You're late, Silas. We've been holding your breath for you." I didn't scream. I couldn't. The air had been sucked out of my lungs. I grabbed the tripod, ripping the cables free, and backed away, keeping the light on the face. The face drifted deeper, sinking into the murk, but the eyes stayed locked on mine. And then the creek began to laugh. It was a low, gurgling sound. the sound of water draining down a massive pipe, but it had the cadence of human laughter. It was mocking me. I turned and ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until the branches whipped my face and drew blood. I didn't stop until I was inside the cabin, with the door bolted and the heavy oak dresser pushed against it. I collapsed on the floor, my wet boots leaving dark stains on the wood. I looked at my hand, the one that had touched the water. The skin was gray, wrinkled, aged. It looked like the hand of an old man. I rubbed it, trying to get the circulation back, but the gray didn't fade. The cold wasn't just on the skin, it was in the bone. I looked at the Tascam recorder. I had left it running during the panic. I needed to know what it captured. I needed to know if the face was real. I hit rewind. I listened to my own panicked breathing. I listened to the splash of the water, and then I heard the voice that had spoken when I saw the face. "You're late, Silas." But there was more. As the recording continued, after the sound of me running away, the microphone, which I had left behind in my haste, kept recording. It picked up the sound of something heavy dragging itself out of the mud. Slap, drag, slap, drag. And then a new voice, a woman's voice, old, ancient. "He left the door open," she whispered. "Yes," the voice of my dead uncle replied. "He brought the key." I looked at the door of the cabin. The dresser was heavy, the deadbolt was steel, but as I watched, a small dark stain began to seep under the doorframe. Water. The creek wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was following me home.
The water seeping under the door wasn't moving like water. It moved like a searching hand. I watched, paralyzed, as the dark stain expanded across the heart pine floorboards of the rookery. It didn't pool, it branched. It followed the grain of the wood, tracing the veins of the dead tree like ink moving through a capillary. And where it touched, the wood instantly grayed. The varnish blistered and peeled with a sound like frying bacon, leaving behind a residue of gray silt that smelled of copper and old wet wool. I grabbed a stack of towels from the bathroom, rough, cheap, motel-quality cotton, and threw them against the gap at the bottom of the door. I shoved them hard against the threshold, using the heel of my boot to wedge them in tight. For a moment, the seeping stopped. The cabin was silent again, save for the frantic thumping of my own heart and the low hum of the refrigerator. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the door. My hand, the one that had touched the creek, was throbbing. I looked down at it in the harsh light of the kitchen. The gray discoloration hadn't spread, but the texture of the skin had changed. It was puckered, pruny, like I had been soaking in a tub for hours. I rubbed it against my jeans, trying to generate friction, trying to warm it up. It remained cold, a dead weight at the end of my wrist. I needed to leave. The realization was sharp and clinical. This wasn't a research site anymore. It was a trap. I grabbed my car keys from the counter. I left the heavy equipment, the tripods, the shotgun mics, the miles of cable where they lay. I just took my laptop, the backup hard drives, and the Tascam handheld recorder. I shoved them into my messenger bag and bolted for the back door. The rookery had 2 exits, the front door, facing the porch and the road, and a back door leading to a small mudroom and the woods. I unlocked the back door and threw it open. I stopped. There was no backyard. There was no gravel path. There was no forest. There was only water. The creek had swollen. It hadn't just risen, it had surrounded the cabin. The dark, oily surface of the Invite was lapping against the threshold of the back door, level with the floorboards. The moonlight reflected off the black water, stretching endlessly into the dark where the trees should have been. The cabin was an island in a black ocean. "Impossible," I whispered. My breath fogged in the sudden cold. I slammed the door shut and locked it. I ran to the front window and tore back the curtains. Water. It was everywhere. The road was gone. The Jeep was gone, submerged or washed away. The water was perfectly still, a sheet of black glass that extended as far as the porch railing. I was besieged. I retreated to the center of the living room, the furthest point from the walls. I felt the house groan. The timber frame was settling, the wood absorbing the moisture rising from beneath. The smell was getting stronger, a cloying, sweet stench of river rot and musk. My phone. I pulled my iPhone from my pocket. No service. Searching blinked in the corner. "Come on," I hissed, pacing a tight circle. "Come on." I tried the landline in the kitchen wall. It was an old rotary phone, a relic Thorne had kept for aesthetic. I picked up the receiver. There was a dial tone. Relief, sharp and hot, flooded my chest. I spun the dial, punching in 911. Click, whir, click.
The line connected. Static hissed, then cleared. "Pike County emergency?" a woman's voice said. She sounded bored, tired, normal. "This is Silas Vane," I shouted, gripping the receiver so hard the plastic creaked. "I'm at the Thorne property, the rookery. I'm trapped. The creek has flooded. The house is surrounded. I need help." There was a pause on the line, a long, heavy silence. "Hello?" I yelled. "Can you hear me?" "I hear you, Silas," the operator said. But her voice had changed. The boredom was gone. The tone was intimate, soft. It was the same voice I had heard on the tape, the voice that sounded like my mother. "Why are you calling, Silas?" she asked gently. "You're already home." I slammed the phone down. I ripped the cord from the wall jack. The receiver, now disconnected and lying on the counter, continued to speak. "Don't be rude, Silas. We're all family here." I backed away, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the stove and swinging it at the phone. Clang! The plastic shattered. The voice stopped. I stood there, panting, the iron skillet vibrating in my hand. I was losing my mind. That was the only explanation. The isolation, the stress, the infrasound. It was inducing a psychotic break. The flood wasn't real. The voices weren't real. I needed an anchor. I needed data. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. The screen glowed blue, the only clean light in the room. I opened the audio files I had transferred before the flood. I needed to hear the recording from the creek again, the one where I saw the face. I needed to analyze it, to find the digital artifact that proved it was a glitch. I scrolled through the file list. File 001.wave,
file 002.wave, file 003.wave, and then, at the bottom of the list, a file I didn't recognize, file 0004.future.wave. The timestamp on the file was for tomorrow, August 16th, 03 a.m. It was currently August 15th, 11:45 p.m. My fingers hovered over the touchpad. This was impossible. A computer glitch, a system clock error. I clicked play. The audio was crisp, no static, no background noise, just the sound of a room. I heard the hum of the refrigerator. I heard the creak of a floorboard. And then I heard myself. "I can't do this anymore," the voice on the recording said. It was my voice, but it was ragged, broken, the voice of a man who had been screaming for hours. "I'll give you what you want. Just let me out." Then a pause. "Say the name," a deep, authoritative voice whispered. "His name is Silence. And what is your name?"
"I don't have one," my voice replied. "I am the vessel." "Good. Now, open the door." Then, on the recording, I heard the sound of a deadbolt sliding back, the squeal of hinges, and then the rush of water. The file ended. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. The laptop said the time was now 11:55 p.m. The recording was a script. It was telling me what I was going to do. "No," I whispered. "I won't do it." I stood up and dragged the heavy oak kitchen table across the room, shoving it against the front door. I piled chairs on top of it. I was barricading myself in. I was breaking the script. But as I worked, I heard a sound that stopped me cold. Splash. It came from inside the house. I turned slowly. The hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom was dark. Splash. Splash. Wet footsteps, heavy, walking on the hardwood. Someone was in the house. I grabbed the skillet again, raising it like a club. "Who's there?" I screamed. "I have a weapon!" The footsteps stopped. From the darkness of the hallway, a shape emerged. It was a man. He was tall, wearing a soaking wet surveyor's coat from the 1920s, heavy leather boots that squelched with every step, and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, dripping. The water falling from his coat wasn't clear. It was black silt. "You're not real," I stammered. "You're a hallucination. Infrasound. It's the infrasound." The figure raised a hand. He pointed at the laptop on the table. "Play it again," he rasped. His voice was dry, like grinding stones, despite the water dripping from his chin. "Who are you?" He took a step forward. The light from the kitchen hit his face. I dropped the skillet. It was Silas Vane, my great-great-uncle, the man from the photograph, but he hadn't aged a day since 1924. His skin was pale, translucent, blue veins mapping his face like rivers. His eyes were missing. In their place were two hollow sockets filled with black water. "I am the one who answered, and you are the one who asked." "I didn't ask for this," I said, backing up until my spine hit the barricaded door. "You brought the machines. ones, Elias said, gesturing to the laptop. You brought the memory. We were quiet, Silas. We were sleeping in the mud. But you brought the playback. He took another step. The smell of rot was overpowering now, making me gag. The creek is a loop, Elias continued, his voice gaining strength, sounding more and more like my own. It plays the same track over and over, but the tape is degrading. We need a new recording. We need a new voice, a clear voice. He reached out. His hand was gray and withered. Why me? I choked out. Because you are the echo, Elias said. You have my face. You have my blood. You are the remaster. He lunged. I threw myself to the side, rolling over the kitchen island. Elias crashed into the counter, his touch instantly rotting the wood. He didn't move fast. He moved with the inevitable, crushing slowness of a rising tide. I scrambled for the laptop. I didn't know why, but I felt like the machine was the key. It was the conduit. Erase it, I yelled at myself. Erase the files. I hammered the delete key. Cannot delete file. File is currently in use. In use by who? I screamed. In use by system administrator. Silence. The power in the cabin cut. The darkness was absolute. The hum of the fridge died. The only light came from the laptop screen, casting a ghostly blue pallor over the room. And in that blue light, I saw them. They weren't just in the hallway anymore. They were everywhere, standing in the corners of the room, sitting on the couch, leaning against the walls. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all soaking wet, all pale, all staring at me with black, watery eyes. The victims, the archive. They weren't ghosts, they were recordings. They were moments of terror trapped in the water, replaying on an endless loop. And they were all whispering the same thing, a low, buzzing chant that filled the room. Join the session, join the session, join the session. I grabbed the laptop and the Tascam recorder and ran for the stairs to the loft. It was the only place left, high ground. I scrambled up the wooden ladder, my boots slipping on the rungs. I kicked the trap door shut and dragged a heavy trunk of blankets over it. I was trapped in the loft, a triangular space under the eaves, hot and stifling. Below me, I heard the kitchen fill with the sound of movement, wet, squelching movement. They were gathering underneath me. I curled into a ball in the corner, clutching the recorder to my chest. I looked at the Tascam. The red light was on. It was recording. I hadn't pressed record. I stared at the spinning reels. The tape counter was moving fast. And then, through the tiny speaker, a voice spoke. It wasn't Elias. It wasn't the victims. It was me.
I can't do this anymore, the recorder said. My heart stopped. This was the line from the future file. I looked at my watch.
It was 2:59 a.m. The script was catching up. I covered my mouth with my hand, refusing to speak. I wouldn't say the next line. I wouldn't. If I didn't say the line, the loop couldn't close. I sat there, trembling, sweat stinging my eyes. 3 a.m. The recorder hissed, waiting. I bit my lip until it bled. I wouldn't speak. Then a pain shot through my chest, sharp, agonizing, like my lungs were filling with water. I gasped, choking, trying to breathe, but there was no air, only the sensation of fluid. I coughed, a violent, hacking spasm. Water spilled from my lips, black, silty water. I wasn't drowning in the creek. The creek was drowning me from the inside. I gagged, spitting up more water, gasping for breath. I can't, I wheezed. I can't do this anymore. The recorder continued to spin. The prophecy was self-fulfilling. From below the trapdoor, the voice of Silas Vane spoke, muffled by the wood, but clear as day. "I'll give you what you want, just let me out." He was saying my lines. He was taking my part. "No!" I screamed, but all that came out was more water. The trapdoor beneath the trunk bumped upward. Once, twice, they were coming up, and I had nowhere left to go but into the narrative. The trapdoor didn't burst open. It dissolved. I watched, hacking up mouthfuls of brackish water, as the thick oak planks of the loft hatch softened. They turned gray, then pulpy, then liquid, dripping down into the hallway below like melting wax. The trunk I had dragged over it simply fell through the floor, landing with a wet thud in the darkness downstairs. The barrier was gone. From the square hole in the floor, a smell rose up that hit me harder than the lack of oxygen. It wasn't just rot anymore. It was the smell of ozone, of burning electrical wires, mixed with the damp earth of a fresh grave. "Silas," the voice of Silas Vane called up. It wasn't angry, it was welcoming. "The session is starting. We need the lead vocal." I scrambled backward, my heels digging into the insulation until my back hit the slanted ceiling of the A-frame. I was cornered in the triangle of the roof. I looked at the dormer window. It was small, sealed with layers of old paint, the glass grimy with decades of pollen. I didn't think. I grabbed the Tascam recorder, my only weapon, my only witness, and smashed the heavy metal casing against the pane. Crack! The glass shattered outward. A rush of wind hit me. It wasn't the humid, stifling air of a Kentucky summer. It was a cold, sterile gale, the kind of wind that blows through a tunnel. I kicked the remaining shards of glass out of the frame and squeezed my body through the opening. The shingles of the roof were slick with moss. I slid,
grappling for a handhold, my fingernails tearing against the grit before I caught the edge of the rain gutter. I hung there for a second, dangling 20 feet above the ground, gasping for air that didn't taste like pond water. Then I looked down. The ground was gone. The rookery wasn't sitting on a hill anymore. It was an island in a vast, motionless sea of obsidian. The forest floor had been swallowed. The trees, massive, ancient oaks, poked out of the black water like skeletal fingers, their leaves stripped, their bark bleached bone white. The water wasn't reflecting the moon. It was glowing faintly from beneath, a dull, sickly phosphorescence that pulsed in time with a rhythm I could feel in my teeth. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the hollow. I looked toward the horizon. The mountains were still there, silhouetted against a purple, bruised sky, but they looked wrong, too steep, too close. It was as if the geography itself had contracted, cinching tight around this single point of trauma. Jump, I whispered to myself. Just jump. I let go. I expected to hit the water with a splash. I expected the cold shock of immersion. I didn't get either. I hit the surface, but instead of breaking through, I bounced. The water had the surface tension of mercury. It yielded under my weight, wrapping around me like a heavy gel, but it didn't let me sink. I lay there, suspended on top of the black fluid, staring up at the roof of the cabin. And then the sound hit me. Lying on the surface of the creek, because the whole world was the creek now, my ears were pressed against the membrane. It wasn't silence. It was a roar. Thousands of voices, screaming, laughing, whispering, praying. It was a dense, overlapping tapestry of sound that drilled straight into my skull. Please, God, not the children. Tell Martha I loved her. The coal, it's in the coal. Silas, Silas, Silas. I scrambled to my hands and knees, fighting the viscosity of the surface, trying to stand. The water felt like oil. It clung to my clothes, heavy and suffocating. I looked back at the cabin. The front door, the one I had barricaded, was wide open. Standing on the submerged porch, staring out at me across the black expanse, was Elias, and behind him, spilling out of the windows, pouring from the chimney, were the others, the gray people, the drowned choir. They weren't chasing me. They were watching, waiting. I turned and ran. I ran across the surface of the water, my boots slapping against the thick liquid. It was like running in a nightmare where your legs feel made of lead, but I pushed forward, aiming for the tree line where the land seemed to rise up out of the flood. I ran for what felt like hours, but my watch, which had stopped at 3 a.m., didn't move. Finally, the ground became solid, mud, real stinking mud. I scrambled up a bank, collapsing into a patch of ferns. I was panting, heaving, but the water in my lungs had subsided. I was dry on the inside again.
I checked my pockets. I still had the Tascam. I still had the laptop bag strapped across my chest. I shone my flashlight around. I was in a clearing I didn't recognize. The trees here were different. They weren't dead. They were preserved. And in the center of the clearing, sitting under a canvas tarp that looked brand new, was a camp. A 1920s survey camp. There was a folding table, a kerosene lantern that was still burning with a steady yellow flame, and a collection of crates stamped with the logo of the Baltimore Geological Society. I walked toward it, my boots squelching in the mud. The silence here was absolute. The voices from the water were gone. I reached the table. On it sat a machine. It was a massive brass and wood phonograph recorder, the kind that etched sound directly onto wax cylinders. A pristine, untouched wax cylinder was loaded onto the spindle. Next to the machine was a leather-bound journal. I opened it. The handwriting was elegant, sharp, and frantic. August 14th, 1924. Surveyor Silas Vane.
The acoustics of this valley are impossible. The rock formations act as natural amplifiers, but they aren't amplifying external sound. They are amplifying thought. I have found the source. It is not a spring. It is a receiver. The locals say the water calls you. They are wrong. The water listens. It waits for a frequency that matches its own. I made a mistake. I spoke my true name into the ravine. I felt the vibration return. It didn't bounce back. It stayed. It nested. The men are gone. They walked into the water this morning. They said they heard their mothers calling them home. I hear nothing but the static, the white noise. It demands a signal. I turned the page. The writing became jagged, erratic. August 15th, 1924. It wants a story. It feeds on narrative. It consumes the beginning, the middle, and the end. If I do not give it an ending, it will never stop. I have to become the ending. I stared at the words. I have to become the ending. I looked at the phonograph. The needle was hovering over the wax, and then I saw the wire. A thin copper wire ran from the phonograph, snaking across the table, down the leg, and into the mud. I followed it with my flashlight beam. The wire ran about 10 feet into the darkness, terminating at a metal stake driven into the ground. And chained to the stake, sitting in the mud with his back to a tree, was a man. He was wearing the same clothes as the Elias on the porch, but this wasn't a ghost. This was a corpse, a desiccated, mummified corpse, skin stretched tight over bone, preserved perfectly by the bog. He had a pair of heavy Bakelite headphones clamped over his ears. The wire from the phonograph led directly into the headphones. I walked closer, the dread pooling in my stomach like lead. The corpse's mouth was open, and inside the mouth, sitting on the dried tongue, was a microphone. A small, primitive microphone wired through the jaw, connected to the earth.
I realized with a jolt of nausea what I was looking at. Elias hadn't just died. He had hooked himself up. He had turned himself into a permanent broadcast loop. I stepped back, revulsion warring with curiosity. The Tascam in my hand beeped. I looked down. The red light was blinking, recording. "No," I whispered. "Stop." I hit the stop button. It didn't work. I hit the power button. Nothing. The digital display on the Tascam flickered and changed text. Input source detected. Syncing. From the headphones on the corpse's head, a sound began to leak. It was faint, tinny, but audible in the dead silence of the clearing. It was clicking. Click, click, click.
The same sound I had heard on the first night. I looked at the phonograph on the table. The wax cylinder began to spin, slowly at first, then gaining speed. The needle dropped. The corpse's chest hitched. I froze. The dried leather skin of the mummy's chest expanded, a crackling sound like dry leaves being crushed. It inhaled. Jesus Christ! I scrambled back, tripping over a root, falling hard onto my back. The corpse didn't open its eyes. It didn't move its arms, but the chest rose and fell. It was breathing. It was being played like an instrument. And then the voice came out of the corpse's mouth, amplified by the microphone, broadcast through the woods, and captured by my Tascam. "Welcome back, Silas," the corpse croaked. The voice was dry, dusty, but perfectly intelligible. "Did you bring the new tape?" I scrambled to my feet, aiming the flashlight at the thing. "You're dead. You're 100 years dead." "Time is just a measure of decay," the corpse replied, its jaw moving stiffly. "The signal doesn't decay. The signal amplifies." The phonograph spun faster. The sound of the clicking in the air grew louder, surrounding me. "We ran out of space," the corpse said. "The wax is full. The mud is full. We need digital. We need infinite storage. We need you." I understood then. The invite wasn't just killing people. It was digitizing them. It was upgrading. Elias was analog. He was the old hardware. I was the upgrade. "I won't do it," I shouted. "I'm leaving. I'm destroying this place." I grabbed the lantern from the table. "I'll burn it down." The corpse laughed, a wheezing, dry sound. "You can't burn water, Silas, and you can't leave. You already recorded your exit." "What?" "Check your pocket." I hesitated. My hand went to the pocket of my jeans. I felt something cold, heavy, wet. I pulled it out. It was a stone, a smooth gray river stone, but carved into the stone, in letters that looked like they had been etched by acid, was a single word: silence. And as I held the stone, I felt the vibration again, the hum. It traveled up my arm, bypassed my ears, and rang directly in the center of my brain. I wasn't holding the stone was holding me. And from the woods around the clearing, the water began to rise. It seeped up from the ground, bubbling through the moss,
It wasn't black this time. It was red, the color of developed film under a darkroom light. The recording session is over. Now begins the mixing. The red water surged forward, washing over the boots of the corpse, washing over the phonograph, and rushing toward me. I turned to run, but the forest was gone. There were no trees, no mountains. There was only a wall of giant towering speakers, stacked hundreds of feet high, blocking out the sky, a wall of sound, and they were all turned on.
The wall of speakers didn't just block the horizon, it obliterated it. They rose hundreds of feet into the bruised purple sky, a monolithic barricade of woofer cones, tweeters, and cracked subwoofers, all lashed together with rusted cables and wet black vines. Some were massive, the size of cars, humming with a bass frequency that rattled my teeth. Others were small, transistor radios, boom boxes, PA horns, screeching with high-pitched static. It was a cathedral of noise, a monument to every sound ever swallowed by the valley. I stood knee-deep in the rising red water, covering my ears, but it was useless. The sound wasn't entering through my ear canals. It was vibrating directly into my bone marrow. It was a physical assault. Help me. It's dark down here. Mama? Silas? The voices weren't distinct anymore. They were layered, compressed into a single agonizing roar of white noise. It was the sound of 1,000 drownings happening at once. I turned to run back toward the survey camp, but the camp was gone. The clearing where I had found Elias's mummified corpse had dissolved into the red muck. The corpse itself was gone, washed away or absorbed into the machinery of the valley. There was only the water, the wall, and me. Thump, thump, thump. The bass kicked in, a rhythm, a heartbeat. With every beat, the red water jumped, splashing against my chest. The level was rising fast. It wasn't water, I realized that now. It tasted metallic, like copper and salt. It was blood mixed with developer fluid, the kind used in old dark rooms to bring ghosts out of the negative. I waded toward the only gap I could see, a narrow fissure between two massive stadium speakers at the base of the wall. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of the nightmare, leaking a chaotic gray light. Move, I screamed at myself. Just move. My legs felt heavy, as if the water was trying to fuse my jeans to my skin.
I dragged myself forward, the Tascam recorder still clutched in my hand like a talisman. I checked the screen. Recording. Time. Infinity. The numbers on the timer were spinning so fast they were a blur. The tape counter was scrolling through years, decades, centuries. I reached the fissure. The sound here was deafening, a wind tunnel of screams. I squeezed through the gap, the rusted metal of the speaker grills tearing at my jacket. I stumbled out onto the other side. Silence. Absolute vacuum-sealed silence. I fell to my knees, gasping, my ears ringing with the phantom echo of the wall. I looked up. I wasn't outside. I was inside.
I was in a hallway, but it wasn't the hallway of the rookery. It was endless, stretching into the dark in both directions. The floor was polished obsidian. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them. Each door was different. Some were rotting wood, some were rusted iron, some were modern, hollow-core bedroom doors. And on every door there was a nameplate. Miller, Timothy, 1954. Holt, Jebediah, 1968. Peterson, Sarah, 1982. I scrambled to my feet, my boots squeaking on the black glass floor. I walked down the line, my breath catching in my throat. Vane, Elias, 1924. The door for Elias was slightly ajar. A faint yellow light spilled out from underneath, along with the smell of stale tobacco and ozone. I kept walking, faster now. I was looking for the exit. I was looking for the end of the tape. Vane, Silas, 2024. I stopped. The door was brand new, a pristine white panel door with a brass handle. The nameplate was fresh, the engraving sharp, but the date was wrong. It didn't say 1924. It didn't say 2024. It said Silas Vane, recording in progress. I stared at the door. I grabbed the handle. It was cold, freezing cold. "Don't go in there," a voice whispered. I spun around. Standing at the other end of the hallway was Elias, but he wasn't the mummy from the woods, and he wasn't the gray corpse from the cabin. He looked normal. He was young, handsome, wearing a clean surveyor's suit. He looked exactly like me if I were wearing a costume. "Don't go in there, Silas," Elias said, his voice echoing in the infinite hallway. "You won't like the acoustics." "What is this place?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "Is this hell?" Hell is a moral concept. This is a geological one. This is the archive, the hard drive. He gestured to the rows of doors. Every sound that enters the valley is stored. Every scream, every prayer, every last breath. The water captures it. The stone amplifies it. We are the librarians.
"I'm not a librarian," I said, backing toward my door. "I'm leaving. I'm deleting the files." "You can't delete what you are," Elias said softly. He began to walk toward me. "You think you came here to study the creek. Silas, look at your hand." I looked down at my right hand, the one holding the Tascam. The plastic casing of the recorder had melted. It had fused with my skin. The buttons were embedded in my palm. The microphone grill was protruding from my knuckles. The wires weren't plugged into the machine. They were snake-bitten into my wrist, pulsing with blue light under the skin.
I screamed and tried to shake it off, but it was part of me. I was the recorder. "You were born for this," Elias said, getting closer. "Why do you think your father left? Why do you think he never told you about this place? He knew the frequency was in your blood. He knew the creek would call you eventually." "No," I whimpered, clawing at the device fused to my flesh. "We need an upgrade, Silas," Elias continued. "I am analog. I am scratchy. I am degrading. You are digital. You are high fidelity. You can carry so much more data." He was 10 feet away. "I won't be your ghost," I shouted. "You aren't the ghost," Elias said, stopping. "You are the medium." I turned and threw open the door marked with my name. I didn't care what was inside. I just needed to get away from him. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. I turned to face the room. I was back in the rookery, but it was stripped. No furniture, no rug, just the bare wooden floor and the single window looking out over the creek. Except the creek wasn't outside. The creek was in the room. It was suspended in the air, a floating, undulating sphere of black water, hovering in the center of the cabin like a dark star. It rippled and churned, defying gravity. And inside the sphere I saw faces, thousands of them, swirling in the current, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. I backed against the door, the Tascam in my hand machine, began to vibrate. Bzzz, and a voice crackled from my own palm. Input source detected, ready to dub. The sphere of water began to spin. It was generating a wind, a centrifugal force that pulled at my clothes, at my hair. I realized then what the realization horror was. It wasn't that I was going to die. It wasn't that I was going to drown. It was that I had never been the protagonist of this story. I was the empty cassette tape, and the recording session was just beginning. I tried to unlock the door, but the handle was gone. The wood had fused shut. The sphere expanded. It grew, eating the air in the room.
"Let me out!" I screamed at the walls. The walls didn't answer, but the sphere did. A face pushed out from the surface of the black water. It was the face of the woman from the phone, my mother. "Don't be afraid, Silas," she whispered, her voice filling the room, filling my head. "We have so much to tell you, and you have such capacity to listen." "I don't want to listen," I yelled. "You don't have a choice," the voice of Elias said from inside the sphere. "You are the new archives. When you leave this room, you will take us with you." My blood froze. "Leave?" I whispered. "You're letting me leave?" "Of course," the voices chorused. "A story isn't scary if it stays in the dark. A story needs an audience. You are going back to the world, Silas." The sphere exploded. It didn't explode with fire. It exploded with liquid. The black water slammed into me, driving me back against the wall. It forced its way into my nose, my mouth, my eyes. It wasn't drowning me. It was filling me. I felt the icy cold slide down my throat, into my stomach, into my veins. I felt the memories of 1,000 dead strangers uploading into my brain. I saw their deaths. I felt their fear. I knew their names. Timothy Miller, drowned 1954, cold. Sarah Peterson, drowned 1982, lonely. Elias Vane, drowned 1924, waiting. My mind was being overwritten. My memories, my childhood in D.C., my thesis, my coffee order, were being deleted to make space for the archive. I tried to scream, but the water choked me. I looked at my hand. The Tascam was glowing bright red. Recording complete. Saving. The world went black. Not the black of death, the black of a tape ending.
The first thing I heard wasn't water. It was the rhythmic, sterile beep of a cardiac monitor. Beep, beep, beep. I opened my eyes. The light was blinding, fluorescent white, sharp and aggressive. It wasn't the soft, murky bioluminescence of the flooded valley. It was the clean, expensive light of a private hospital room. I sat up, gasping, my hands flying to my throat. I expected to cough up black silt. I expected to feel the cold, oily residue of the creek in my lungs. But I breathed air, dry, conditioned, recycled hospital air that smelled of rubbing alcohol and floor wax. "Mr. Vane?" A nurse stood in the doorway. She was young, wearing blue scrubs, holding a clipboard. She looked at me with professional detachment, not the hungry, hollow stare of the drowned. "You're awake," she said, checking a monitor. "Dr. Evans will be pleased. You've been out for 2 days." I looked at my hands. They were pale, shaking, but they were mine. The Tascam recorder wasn't fused to my palm. The wires weren't snake-bitten into my veins. There were no scars, no gray discoloration, just my own skin, pink and living. "Where?" My voice was a croak. I cleared my throat. It felt raw, like I'd been screaming for hours. "Where am I?" She said, Pikeville Medical Center. A road crew found you walking along Route 119 near the county line. You were dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion. They brought you in." "Dehydrated?" I whispered. The word felt like a joke, a cruel cosmic punchline. I had drowned. I had been filled with a century of water. "And the cabin? The rookery?" I asked, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. "The flood?" She gave me a pitying look, the kind reserved for city people who crack under the isolation of the mountains. "Mr. Vane, it hasn't rained in Pike County for 3 weeks. The creek bed behind that cabin is bone dry." They released me 2 days later. I didn't go back to the cabin. I paid Elias Thorne over the phone, transferring the money plus an extra $500 for cleaning fees I didn't explain. I told him to burn the equipment I'd left behind. He didn't argue. He just laughed that dry, rattling laugh and hung up. I drove back to D.C. in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't listen to podcasts. The silence of the car felt safe. I told my advisor at the university that the field research was a bust. Equipment failure, I lied. Corrupted data. He was disappointed, but he bought it. He told me to take some time off, to recalibrate.
So I did. I went back to my apartment in Adams Morgan. I went back to my life of coffee shops, late-night grading, and the dull, comforting roar of city traffic. For a month, everything was normal. Or at least that's what I told myself. The first sign was the thirst. It started a week after I got back. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my mouth as dry as sandpaper, my tongue swollen. I would drink a glass of water from the tap, then another, then a pitcher. It was never enough. The water didn't feel like it was hydrating me. It felt like it was disappearing into a void inside my stomach. Then came the condensation. I would sit at my desk grading papers and notice damp spots appearing on the wood. Not rings from a glass, but sweat. The desk was sweating. The walls of my apartment began to peel, the paint bubbling as if there was a leak behind the plaster. The landlord came, checked the pipes, and found nothing. "Humidity," he grunted. "Get a dehumidifier." I bought 3. They filled up every 4 hours. I was emptying gallons of water a day from the air of a 3rd-floor apartment in a brick building. But the worst part was the mirror. I stopped shaving because I couldn't look at my reflection. Every time I caught my own eyes in the glass, I saw a flicker, a delay. I would blink, and my reflection would stare back for a split second too long before blinking in return. And the eyes, they were getting darker. My eyes had always been hazel. Now they were turning a deep, muddy brown, almost black. October 15th, 2 months since I left Kentucky. I was in the university library, the basement archives. It was quiet down there, the only sound the hum of the HVAC system. I was looking for a distraction. I pulled a random microfilm reel, Civil War records, nothing related to acoustics. I threaded the machine. As I scrolled through the dates, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't that it got quieter, it got heavier. The air pressure dropped, my ears popped. Click, click, click. It was the sound of stones knocking together underwater. I turned slowly. There was no one there, just rows of metal shelves. "Is someone there?" I called out. My voice didn't echo. It was absorbed instantly, sucked into the books as if they were made of sponge. Then came the whisper. "Silas." It came from my left. I spun around. Nothing. "Silas." It came from my right.
I stood up, knocking my chair over. "Stop it," I hissed. I left you there." A laugh drifted through the stacks. It was soft, wet, and familiar. It was Elias. "You can't leave the session, Silas. You're the recording device." I grabbed my bag and ran. I burst out of the archives, past the bewildered librarian, and out into the autumn sunlight of the campus quad. I sat on a bench, hyperventilating. People were walking by, students laughing, professors arguing, tourists taking photos. Life, normal life. I needed to hear it. I needed to drown out the voice in my head. I pulled out my phone. I opened my voice memo app. I just wanted to record the ambient noise of the city, the traffic, the birds, anything to prove that the world was loud and alive. I hit the red button. The waveform on the screen was flat, dead flat. I looked around. A group of students was walking right past me, shouting and laughing. A bus was idling at the curb, its engine roaring. A jackhammer was pounding on the pavement a block away. But the phone wasn't picking up any of it. I tapped the microphone. Nothing. Then the waveform spiked, a massive, jagged red line that nearly broke the screen. But there was no sound in the quad that matched it. I lifted the phone to my ear. I played it back. The recording wasn't of the campus. It was the sound of rushing water, a torrent, a flood, and underneath the water, voices. "Let me in. It's cold. Silas is the door." I dropped the phone. It cracked on the pavement. I stared at my hands. They were trembling, and they were wet. Water was seeping out of my pores, not sweat, cold, clear water. It dripped from my fingertips, creating a small puddle on the concrete. A student stopped, a young girl, maybe 19. She looked at me with concern. "Sir," she asked, "are you okay? You look really pale." I looked up at her, and in that moment, the horror didn't just hit me, it clarified. I remembered Elias's words in the flooded cabin. We need an upgrade. We need infinite storage. They didn't want my body. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted a carrier. I wasn't a survivor. I was a vessel. I was a walking, breathing hard drive, carrying the frequency of Rowan Creek out of the mountains and into the world. And I was leaking. "Sir?" the girl asked again, stepping closer. "Do you need help?" I tried to warn her. I tried to say, "Run! Get away from me!" I opened my mouth, but I didn't speak. Instead, a sound erupted from my throat that wasn't human. It was a low, resonant thrum, a sub-bass frequency that vibrated the bench, the pavement, and the girl's bones. Hum. The girl's eyes went wide. She froze, her mouth opening in a silent gasp. She wasn't scared. She was entranced. Her eyes, bright blue a moment ago, suddenly dulled. They turned gray, then black. She took a step toward me. "Silas," she whispered, but it wasn't her voice. It was the voice of the creek. I tried to close my mouth to stop the transmission, but my jaw locked. I was broadcasting. The students walking behind her stopped. They turned. One by one, their expressions went slack. One by one, they turned toward me. The bus driver opened his door and stepped out, his eyes black pools. The construction workers dropped their tools. They all began to walk toward the bench. They weren't attacking, they were listening. They were sinking. I realized then that the invite wasn't a place, it was a signal, and I was the tower. I looked down at the puddle of water beneath my feet. It was spreading. It was touching the girl's shoes. It was running into the street. It was finding the storm drains. It was going to the Potomac, then to the Chesapeake, then to the ocean. I tried to scream, to break the loop, but the only sound that came out of me was the sound of water rising. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since I left Kentucky, I felt peace, the terrible cold peace of the deep. I wasn't Silas Vane anymore. I was the mouth, and the session was just beginning.
If you survive this story, don't forget to subscribe, because the next one will be even darker. Good night, and remember, the shadows are still watching. Subscribe for more horror.